My name is Luna. I'm in my mid-30s now, but at the time this story began, I was younger, still believing that competence, patience, and good faith were enough to protect a person at work. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I've never been. I don't dominate meetings. I don't posture. I don't have confidence. Most people would describe me as calm, reliable, maybe even a little hard to read. And because of that, I'm often underestimated. People tend to assume that if you're quiet, you're harmless. If you don't escalate, you won't resist. If you don't dramatize harm, then harm must not really exist. I learned slowly and painfully how wrong that assumption can be, especially inside corporate systems that pride themselves on procedure while quietly erasing people. This is not a revenge story. It's not a takedown. It's not about shouting, exposing names, or burning bridges. This is a documentary style account of what it feels like when you do everything right, and the system still chooses convenience over truth. The title says it plainly. I reported harassment to HR. I was laid off 3 weeks later. What it doesn't say is how quietly it happened, how cleanly, how professionally. The complaint disappeared. My job did not. What follows is a first-person account of emotional justice, not the kind that arrives with applause, but the kind that comes with clarity. It's about psychological reversal, not confrontation. About quiet dominance, not visible power. About what happens when you stop asking to be protected and start observing how protection is selectively applied. Over the course of this story, you'll hear about small moments most people would overlook. Comments that were probably nothing, patterns that were easy to dismiss, silences that were framed as maturity. You'll hear how I normalized things I shouldn't have, how I learned to be useful without being seen, and how eventually I noticed something shift, not around me, but inside me. This story moves slowly on purpose, because that's how these things actually happen. Harm in professional environments rarely announces itself. It accumulates. It hides behind policies, smiles, and unfortunate timing. And when consequences arrive, they're framed as neutral. I want to be honest about that, not dramatic. I'm telling this story because many people believe that if something truly unjust happened, it would look obvious, loud, documented, undeniable. But often, injustice looks like a calendar invite, a severance packet, a carefully worded email. If you've ever felt invisible at work, if you've ever questioned your own memory because no one else seemed concerned, if you've ever done the brave thing quietly and paid for it later, then this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you what happened exactly as it unfolded and what it changed in me. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever stayed silent not because you were weak, but because you believed silence was safer? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that followed me from performance reviews to hallway conversations. Dependable, steady, solid, the kind of employee you don't worry about, the kind you assume will handle things without supervision, without complaint, without noise. I wasn't invisible in the literal sense. People knew my name. They knew what I did. They came to me when something broke or when a process quietly failed and needed fixing without attracting attention. I was looped into emails when things were urgent, but removed when decisions were made. I was trusted with responsibility, but rarely with authority. At the time I told myself this was respect. I worked as a senior operations analyst, a role that sat in the quiet middle of the company, between leadership and execution. My job was to see patterns, catch risks early, smooth friction before it escalated. I liked that work. It rewarded observation. It favored people who listened more than they spoke. In meetings, I didn't fight for airtime. I waited until there was space. When I did speak, people nodded. Sometimes they took notes. Occasionally, someone else repeated my point 5 minutes later and received credit for a great insight. I noticed, but I didn't correct it. That felt petty. I believed consistency would speak louder over time. I dressed neutrally. I kept my tone even. I didn't socialize much after work, not because I disliked my coworkers, but because I valued separation. I believed professionalism meant boundaries. That belief would later be used against me. When new hires joined, I was often asked to onboard them. Luna will take care of you, managers would say. She knows how things really work. And I did. I showed people the shortcuts no one documented. I warned them gently about which approvals mattered and which were ceremonial. I protected them from making mistakes that would linger on their reputations. What I didn't realize was that, in doing so, I was quietly accepting a role that came with no visibility and unlimited emotional labor. I was the person people relaxed around. They spoke freely near me, complained, ventilated, sometimes crossed lines they didn't cross with others. I was perceived as safe, not powerful, just safe. Someone who wouldn't escalate, wouldn't report, wouldn't push back. At the time, I thought this meant I was trusted. Looking back, I see it differently. There's a particular kind of underestimation that feels like comfort. You're not challenged. You're not threatened. You're not considered dangerous. People don't guard their words around you. They don't calculate consequences. They assume you will absorb discomfort the same way you absorb extra work, quietly. No one ever asked me how I was doing. Not really. When workloads piled up, the assumption was that I could handle it. When deadlines were unrealistic, the expectation was that I'd find a way. When something sensitive needed discretion, it landed on my desk. When something risky needed deniability, my name wasn't attached. I was praised for being low maintenance. That phrase stayed with me. Low maintenance meant I didn't need reassurance. Low maintenance meant I didn't require acknowledgement. Low maintenance meant I wouldn't be difficult if something went wrong. I didn't complain because at first, there was nothing obvious to complain about, no single event that screamed injustice. Just a gradual shaping of expectations, a subtle narrowing of how much space I was allowed to take up. I told myself I was lucky. The company was stable. The pay was fair. I had autonomy. I wasn't micromanaged. I wasn't openly disrespected, at least not in ways that were easy to name. And so, when small moments of discomfort surfaced, I filed them away. I gave people the benefit of the doubt. I reminded myself that intent mattered, that misunderstanding was not malicious. That mindset made me very good at my job. It also made it easy to misjudge, because what they never seemed to notice was this. I remembered everything. Dates, phrases, patterns. I didn't react. I observed. And at that stage, to them, I was exactly what they needed me to be. Useful, calm, replaceable in theory, indispensable in practice. Someone who would keep things running smoothly. Someone who would never cause a problem. At least that's who they thought I was. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. Not because it was subtle in content, but because it was subtle in delivery. It arrived wrapped in familiarity, disguised as humor, softened by a smile that made it easy to dismiss. We were in a small project sync, 5 of us, cameras on, nothing formal. The conversation drifted the way it often did when deadlines were still far enough away to feel theoretical. Someone made a joke about how operations always overthink everything. Another person laughed and said, "Well, that's Luna's job, right?" It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even untrue. On the surface, everyone laughed, including me. But something about the way it landed stayed with me longer than it should have. The joke framed my role not as strategic, but as fussy. Not as foresight, but as obstruction. And no one countered it. No one added context. No one said, "That's why we don't get blindsided." I told myself I was being sensitive. Later that same week, I sent a written risk assessment ahead of a leadership review. It was thorough, as usual. Clear timelines, documented dependencies, a note about potential exposure if a certain compliance step was skipped. In the meeting, my manager summarized it out loud. Not inaccurately, just selectively. The caution became, Luna has some concerns. The recommendations became things to keep in mind. The room moved on. Afterward, a colleague messaged me privately. "Good catch on that risk. Glad you flagged it." Glad you flagged it. Not glad you were heard. Not glad it was addressed. Just glad it existed quietly in the background in case it was needed later. That was the first small cut. Not the joke, not the meeting. The realization that my role was to notice problems, not to be taken seriously when I named them. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Not frequent enough to feel patterned, just often enough to feel familiar. A comment about my tone being very direct when I asked for clarification, said lightly as feedback, never written down. A suggestion that I might be misreading intent when I raised a concern about how a contractor spoke to me. A reminder to assume positive intent delivered with a smile that closed the conversation rather than opened it. None of these moments triggered alarms. If I'd gone to HR then, I wouldn't have known what to say. There was no single quote that stood alone. No witness was eager to confirm anything inappropriate had occurred, and that's how it worked. Each interaction, taken alone, was nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that was easy to feel and hard to prove. I started adjusting without realizing it, softening my language further, adding disclaimers before speaking, smiling more when something felt off. I told myself I was being adaptable, professional, strategic. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. The thing about being calm and observant is that people often test the edges of what you'll tolerate, not aggressively, experimentally. They watch your face, your response time, your willingness to let something pass. When you don't push back, they learn. One afternoon during a cross-functional call, a senior colleague interrupted me mid-sentence. Not once, twice. The third time I stopped speaking. No one noticed. The conversation moved on without my input, even though the topic was directly tied to my area of responsibility. After the call, my manager said, "You were really quiet in there." Not, "You were interrupted," not, "Your perspective was missing," just quiet. I nodded, took the note. That evening, I opened my slim black notebook for the first time in months. Not to vent, not to dramatize, just to write down what happened in neutral language. Date, meeting name, who spoke, what was said. No adjectives, no conclusions. At the time, I didn't think I was documenting harm. I told myself I was tracking patterns for my own clarity, a way to check if I was imagining things. I still believed the system worked. I still believed intent mattered. I still believed that if something crossed a line, it would be obvious to everyone, not just me. I had no idea how useful that notebook would become. Because the first small cut doesn't hurt much. It only teaches you where you're allowed to bleed. Once you learn where the line is, you start stepping around it without being asked. That's the quiet part no one talks about. After the first few moments, the jokes, the interruptions, the soft dismissals, I didn't feel angry. I felt alert, like someone who had brushed against a sharp edge and adjusted their grip without thinking. I began to anticipate friction before it happened. If I had a concern, I prefaced it with reassurance. This might be nothing, but I could be wrong here. Just flagging this in case it's helpful. My language became padded, not because my thinking had softened, but because I had learned that certainty from me made people uncomfortable. Confidence from me invited correction. Calm disagreement from me was reframed as negativity, so I adapted. When meetings ran long, I stayed quiet. When decisions skipped necessary steps, I followed up privately instead of publicly. When someone took credit for work that overlapped with mine, I told myself the outcome mattered more than recognition. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through overt cruelty, but through repeated accommodation. I was still performing well. My reviews remained positive. Words like reliable and consistent appeared again and again, but something else crept in alongside them. Not very visible, could be more vocal, might benefit from stronger presence. Presence? It's a vague word, hard to argue with, easy to weaponize. I was expected to be present without being disruptive, vocal without being challenging, assertive without being memorable. At some point, I stopped expecting backup. When a colleague made a comment that edged too close to personal about how I was very serious compared to others, I smiled and let it pass. When someone joked about how I was married to the spreadsheet, I laughed along. I learned which versions of myself were acceptable and which created tension. The thing that made it difficult to name what was happening was that no one was unkind all the time. Some days were easy, some people were genuinely respectful. The inconsistency kept me off balance. It made me question my own perceptions. On good days, I told myself I was overthinking. On bad days, I told myself this was just how workplaces were. I started to notice that certain colleagues felt entitled to my time in ways they didn't with others. Messages sent late in the evening, requests framed as favors but treated as obligations. When I didn't respond immediately, the follow-up came quickly. "Just bumping this," as if urgency was assumed. I complied, not because I lacked boundaries, but because I didn't want to be mischaracterized. I knew how quickly narratives formed around people who said no. I was careful. What I didn't realize was that my carefulness was being read as consent. The contractor I worked with most closely began to speak to me differently than he spoke to others. Casual comments about my availability, observations about my demeanor. Once, during a call, he said, "You're always so calm. I don't think I've ever seen you get upset." It was said like a compliment. I smiled, said nothing. Afterward, I wrote it down. Not because it was offensive on its own, but because it fit. By then, my notebook had become a quiet ritual. I didn't review it often, I just added to it. Facts without commentary. A private archive of moments that didn't warrant escalation but refused to fade. I still believed that escalation required certainty, and certainty felt impossible. There was always another explanation, another interpretation that made me seem unreasonable if I challenged it. I told myself I was choosing peace, choosing professionalism, choosing to stay focused on my work. But something subtle shifted inside me. I stopped assuming good intent by default. I started watching how people behaved when they thought no one would challenge them, how jokes were tested and retracted if they didn't land, how feedback was delivered differently depending on who was in the room. I realized that respect in this environment was not a given. It was responsive. People adjusted based on what they believed you would tolerate, and I had taught them a great deal. The normalization didn't feel like defeat. It felt like a strategy. I convinced myself that staying quiet preserved my position, that visibility carried risk, that being low maintenance was a form of safety. I hadn't yet seen the cost. Because when disrespect becomes normal, it doesn't announce the moment it crosses into harm. It simply deepens, becomes bolder, less careful. And by the time you recognize it as something you should name, the system has already learned how to minimize you. I was still doing everything right. I just didn't realize how much of myself I had already given up to make that possible. I didn't choose the role they gave me. I stepped into it gradually, the way you do when expectations are never stated outright, but reinforced through repetition. No one sat me down and said, "This is who you are here." They didn't need to. The boundaries were drawn in reaction to what I did, and more importantly, what I didn't challenge. I was the stabilizer. When projects went off track, I was brought in to quietly fix them. When leadership needed reassurance, I was asked for analysis, not opinions. When tensions surfaced between teams, I was expected to smooth them over, translate intentions, and absorb frustration. I was reliable in the way furniture is reliable. Present, useful, unquestioned. In meetings, people would look to me for confirmation, not direction. "Luna, does this work?" is rarely followed by, "Luna, what do you think we should do?" My role was to validate decisions already forming, not to shape them. I noticed that when I did challenge something, carefully, politely, the room went still. Not hostile, just attentive in a way that suggested I had broken an unspoken rule. The feedback afterward was never about the content, it was about delivery. "You came across pretty strong in there." Some people might have felt shut down. Your point was valid, but the timing became another moving target. I was expected to speak early enough to be useful, but not so early that it disrupted momentum. Late enough to be safe, but not so late that it appeared reactive. There was no correct window, only wrong ones. Slowly, I learned to anticipate the shape of conversations and insert myself only where I was least likely to cause friction. I became fluent in reading rooms, in predicting who would support an idea and who would bristle. That skill made me valuable. It also made me small. I saw how others were allowed to be inconsistent, how certain colleagues could be abrupt without consequence, how passion was praised in some and labeled as aggression in others. The difference wasn't behavior, it was an expectation. They expected me to be calm, so calmness became my cage. Any deviation stood out. There was an unspoken agreement. I would keep things running smoothly, and in return, I would not demand visibility, credit, or protection. The agreement was never fair, but it was stable. Stability can be seductive. I told myself I didn't need recognition, that my work spoke for itself, that being behind the scenes gave me freedom. I believed that not being noticed meant not being targeted. I was wrong. Because when something goes wrong in a system, the person assigned to stabilize it is often the first to be questioned. Not publicly, quietly. In side conversations and emails you're not copied on. The contractor's behavior continued to evolve. Nothing explicit, nothing I could quote without sounding dramatic, just a growing familiarity that ignored professional distance. Comments about how well we worked together, jokes about how much time we spent on calls. Once, a remark about how I was easier to talk to than most people here. I didn't reciprocate, I redirected, I kept things formal. I also wrote it down. What troubled me wasn't just the behavior, it was the context in which it was happening. He felt comfortable speaking to me that way because he believed I wouldn't escalate, because I was the stabilizer, the one who handled things quietly. And if I did say something, I suspected how it would be framed. Misunderstanding, cultural difference, intent. Those words hovered in the background of every interaction. I realized then that the role I had been assigned came with a condition. My discomfort was acceptable as long as it didn't disrupt output, as long as the machine kept running. I wasn't being asked to endure harm, I was expected to absorb it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you understand the role you've been given, you can decide whether to keep playing it or to use it. At that point, I still hadn't decided. But I stopped believing that staying invisible would keep me safe. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no email that crossed an obvious line, no moment I could point to and say, "This is when everything changed." It happened on an ordinary Tuesday during an ordinary call in the space between what was said and what was assumed. I was on a one-on-one video call with the contractor I'd been working with for months. We were reviewing timelines. Nothing personal, nothing unusual. Halfway through, he leaned back in his chair and said casually, "You're always so composed. I don't know how you do it. Most people would have lost patience with me by now." I smiled, out of habit. Then he added, "I like that about you. Makes it easy to say things." There it was. Not inappropriate enough to quote cleanly, not explicit enough to shock, but unmistakable in implication. The comment wasn't about my work. It was about access, about comfort, about a sense of permission. I felt something settle in my chest, not fear, not anger, clarity. I realized that my calm wasn't being respected. It was being interpreted as availability. I finished the call professionally. No change in tone, no visible reaction. When it ended, I sat still for a moment, hands resting on my desk, and let myself register what had just happened without minimizing it. I didn't ask myself whether he meant harm. I asked myself whether the behavior would continue. That was new. I opened my notebook and wrote it down. The exact words, the time, the context. Then I wrote a second line, something I had never written before. "This pattern is escalating." That sentence mattered. It was the first time I allowed myself to name progression, not just isolated moments. The first time I stopped treating each interaction as independent and started seeing them as connected. Later that day, I joined a team meeting. The same colleague interrupted me again. Same rhythm, same ease. And for the first time, instead of shrinking back, I noticed something else. No one corrected him, not because they agreed, but because they didn't see it as their role. The system was working as designed. That evening, I went for a walk without headphones. I replayed conversations from the past 6 months, not emotionally, but analytically. I saw how often my discomfort had been reframed as sensitivity, how frequently the burden of adjustment had landed on me. I realized I had been managing everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. The shift wasn't rage. It was the quiet decision to stop gaslighting myself. I didn't decide to report anything that day. I didn't draft an email or ask for advice. I simply allowed myself to believe my own perception without needing external validation. That changed everything. Because once you trust your own interpretation, you stop negotiating with doubt. I began to think differently about silence, not as avoidance, but as choice. I realized that every time I stayed quiet, I was sending a signal, not just to others, but to myself, about what I was willing to tolerate, and I was tired of sending the wrong one. Over the next few days, I paid attention to how often I preemptively softened my language, how often I absorbed friction without comment. I noticed the effort it took, the constant calculation. I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. What would happen if I stopped protecting the system from its own behavior? Not sabotaging it, not confronting anyone, just documenting accurately, responding consistently, letting things be seen as they were. The idea didn't feel brave. It felt inevitable. I still believed in fairness. I still believed in process, but I no longer believed those things worked automatically. They required input, evidence, timing, and I had all three. That day, nothing outward changed. I still showed up, still did my work, still smiled in meetings, still met deadlines, but internally, I crossed a line. I stopped assuming that my silence was neutral. I understood that silence was already doing work. And if I were going to be quiet, it would be intentional. Once I understood that silence was not passive, I stopped using it unconsciously. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I didn't suddenly become outspoken. I didn't challenge comments in real time or correct interruptions mid-meeting. From the outside, nothing about my behavior looked different. I was still composed, still measured, still easy to work with. But the reason for my quiet had changed. Before, silence was a reflex, an attempt to preserve harmony. Now it was a strategy. I began to respond with precision instead of accommodation. If someone spoke over me, I didn't rush to reinsert myself. I followed up in writing clearly, referencing the moment without emotion. As I was outlining earlier, became a recurring phrase. Neutral, documented. When the contractor made another comment that edged toward familiarity, we make a good team, don't we? Feels like we're always aligned. I acknowledged the work and redirected immediately. No warmth, no invitation. The shift was subtle, but intentional. He noticed. I could tell by the pause that followed, the recalibration, the way he became more careful with his phrasing afterward, not respectful, cautious. That told me something important. People adjust when they sense boundaries, even unspoken ones. But they only do so when they believe those boundaries have consequences. I continued documenting, not obsessively, selectively. I tracked escalation, not annoyance, patterns, not personality. I noted who was present, what was said, and how it was framed. I also started saving emails, taking screenshots of chat messages that disappeared after being edited, downloading meeting notes before they were cleaned up. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this, not because it was secretive, but because it was private. At the same time, I became more aware of how systems protect themselves, how HR language emphasizes neutrality, how managers are trained to de-escalate rather than resolve. I reread company policies, not looking for reassurance, but for gaps. There were many. The harassment policy was clear in principle and vague in application. It emphasized intent, impact, and reporting channels, but offered little guidance on what happened when behavior lived in the gray space, the kind of gray space I was documenting. I realized then that if I ever did report what was happening, the story would matter as much as the facts. and stories are shaped by what exists on record. So I focused on the record. In meetings, I became more deliberate about summarizing next steps in writing. In emails, I clarified assumptions. I stopped translating other people's behavior to make it more palatable. If something was unclear, I asked for clarification, politely, directly, and in writing. This had an unexpected effect. People started being more careful around me. Not kinder, not warmer, more careful. My silence was no longer an empty space they could fill casually. It had edges. The contractor stopped making personal comments. Instead, he became formal to the point of stiffness. He copied more people on emails. He deferred decisions he used to make unilaterally. It was subtle, but it confirmed what I already knew. He understood the risk had shifted, even if he didn't know how. What surprised me was how uncomfortable others seemed with my neutrality. When I stopped cushioning feedback, some colleagues misread it as withdrawal. A manager asked if everything was okay. I said yes, which was true. I was okay in a way I hadn't been before, because I was no longer absorbing confusion. I was observing behavior as data. I wasn't waiting for permission to feel uncomfortable. I wasn't seeking consensus about my experience. I was preparing, quietly. And preparation changes posture, even when nothing is said. I noticed that my work became sharper. My analysis is more decisive. I stopped over-explaining. I trusted my own judgment again. That confidence didn't announce itself. It showed up in what I no longer did. I no longer apologized for clarity. I no longer softened facts to protect feelings. I no longer assumed misunderstanding when patterns repeated. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and in that space, people reveal themselves. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I was learning, but I knew this. If something happened next, I would be ready to respond, not react. Quietly, cleanly, on record. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. Not about them individually, but about the system they trusted to protect them, and how often that system relied on people like me to stay quiet in order to function smoothly. Once silence became intentional, my attention sharpened. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing in a dramatic sense. I was looking for structure, for incentives, for what was rewarded, what was ignored, and what was quietly buried. I began mapping patterns the way I did in my actual job. Who spoke freely in meetings without consequence, who was interrupted and expected to recover gracefully, whose mistakes were reframed as learning opportunities, whose concerns were labeled tone issues. I noticed how often risk conversations happened off the record, how decisions were justified retroactively, how language softened as it traveled upward, becoming less specific, less accountable. I watched how HR was referenced, not as a resource, but as a threat. We don't want this to become an HR thing, people would say, usually when someone raised a legitimate concern. That phrase alone told me everything. HR wasn't there to protect people. It was there to protect the company from liability. Sometimes those goals overlapped. Often they didn't. I didn't become cynical. I became realistic. I reviewed past performance feedback, noting how often my calmness had been praised without acknowledging the emotional labor it required. I cross-referenced that with moments where my boundaries were tested. The correlation was clear. The more dependable I was perceived to be, the more others felt entitled to my tolerance. The contractor's behavior had stopped escalating, but the dynamic it revealed remained relevant. It showed me how quickly comfort turns into presumption when there's no visible resistance. I also noticed something else. My manager rarely documented verbal feedback. Conversations happened in one-on-ones, not follow-up emails. Suggestions about my presence and visibility were never written down. Praise was vague, critique was abstract. That wasn't accidental. Ambiguity protects the speaker. Specificity creates accountability. So I created my own specificity. After one-on-ones, I began sending recap emails. Brief, neutral. Thanks for the conversation today. As discussed, key takeaways are: I listed action items and feedback as clearly as possible. Sometimes my manager replied with a simple "looks good." Sometimes he didn't reply at all. Either way, the record existed. I noticed a shift in how people spoke to me once these emails became routine. Fewer offhand remarks, more careful phrasing, less reliance on implication. Again, not warmth, caution. Behind the scenes, I also began learning about employment law, not obsessively, but enough to understand the framework. What constituted retaliation? How timing mattered? What companies documented internally versus what they disclosed? I didn't consult a lawyer. I wasn't planning a case. I was educating myself. Knowledge changes how you hear conversations. Phrases like restructuring, realignment, and performance calibration started sounding less neutral. I saw how easily narratives could be shaped after the fact. I also realized how much institutional memory depended on individuals. When someone left, context disappeared. Decisions lost authorship, responsibility blurred. That insight stayed with me. At the same time, I remained outwardly unchanged. I didn't share my observations. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I continued delivering high-quality work. If anything, my output improved. This too was strategic, because credibility matters when silence eventually breaks. What they never noticed was that I was positioning myself, not for conflict, but for clarity. If something escalated, I wanted the contrast to be undeniable. Calm professionalism on one side, documented inconsistency on the other hand. They assumed my quiet meant disengagement. It didn't. It meant focus. I stopped participating in casual venting. I avoided speculative conversations. I declined invitations that blurred boundaries. Not dramatically, just consistently. This made some people uneasy. One colleague asked, half joking, "You've gone very official lately. Everything okay?" I smiled, said yes, which was still true, because I was no longer trying to belong in spaces that relied on my silence. The final thing they never noticed was how prepared I was becoming to let go. Not emotionally, logistically. I updated my resume, not urgently, just accurately. I reviewed my savings. I noted which projects were critical and which were redundant. I made sure my personal files were backed up and my work files were organized. Not because I planned to leave, but because readiness is a form of leverage. I wasn't afraid anymore. I understood the terrain. I knew where I stood, and I knew that if I ever chose to speak formally, it would not be as a confused employee seeking validation. It would be like a professional presenting a record, and records have weight. I didn't yet know when or if I would use what I had learned, but I knew this. The version of me they thought they understood no longer existed. The reveal didn't come from a single document. It came from alignment. One evening, after a long but uneventful day, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook alongside my email archive, not with the intention of building a case, just to review what I already had, end to end, without minimizing or justifying any of it. For the first time, I looked at the whole picture at once. Dates lined up in a way they hadn't before. Comments that felt ambiguous in isolation formed a progression when placed side by side. Shifts in tone coincided with changes in documentation. Moments where I had pulled back were followed by moments where others pressed forward. It wasn't dramatic, it was coherent. I realized that what I had wasn't a story of a single bad actor or a single broken rule. It was a pattern of boundary testing enabled by ambiguity and protected by process, a pattern that became visible only when someone bothered to keep track, and I had kept track. What struck me most wasn't the behavior itself, it was the predictability. Once I saw the pattern, I could anticipate responses before they happened. I could tell when something would be reframed, when concern would be softened, when silence would be encouraged in the name of keeping things professional. That's when I understood the leverage I had. Not power in the loud sense, not authority. Context. I knew how the company framed risk. I knew which departments avoided scrutiny and which absorbed it. I knew how HR evaluated complaints, not just on merit, but on complexity, exposure, and timing. And I knew where I fit in that equation. I wasn't a high-risk employee. I had no history of conflict, no performance issues, no documented complaints. My record was clean. That made me credible. It also made me, because if someone like me raised a formal concern, it wouldn't be easy to dismiss as emotional or impulsive. It would require attention, documentation, process. And process, I had learned, was something the system avoided unless absolutely necessary. The private reveal wasn't excitement or vindication. It was a restraint. I realized that I didn't need to convince anyone of my experience emotionally. I only needed to present it accurately, calmly, with dates, quotes, context. I also realized something else, something harder. Reporting would not protect me. That truth landed quietly but firmly. I understood enough about organizational behavior to know that formal complaints create ripples. Ripples attract attention. Attention demands resolution, and resolution often favors the path of least disruption. I wasn't naive anymore. If I reported what I had documented, the system would respond. Not necessarily with justice, but with risk management. And I needed to be prepared for what that might look like. That didn't stop me, but it changed how I thought about timing. I didn't rush. I didn't ask for advice from coworkers. I didn't float hypotheticals. I kept working, observing, refining. I noticed how often decisions about headcount and restructuring were discussed in abstract terms, how easily narratives about performance could be shaped if needed, how quickly attention moved on once something was labeled resolved. The leverage I had wasn't a guarantee of safety. It was clarity. I could see the board now. And once you see the board, you stop making moves impulsively. I asked myself a difficult question. What outcome am I actually seeking? Not revenge, not validation, not an apology. Accountability. And accountability, I knew, doesn't always look like vindication. Sometimes it looks like documentation that outlives you, records that don't disappear, patterns that can't be erased once named. That understanding grounded me. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. The next step wouldn't be emotional. It would be procedural. And procedures, unlike feelings, leave trails. That night, I closed my notebook and didn't open it again for a week. Not because I was hesitating, because I was deciding. The decision didn't arrive as certainty. It arrived as a narrowing. Over the course of a week, I watched my options reduce themselves. Not because choices disappeared, but because only one of them remained aligned with who I was willing to be. I could stay silent. That option was still available. Nothing had forced my hand yet. The contractor had become more careful. My manager hadn't raised any new concerns. My workload was steady. On the surface, things had stabilized. Silence would be easy, but I knew what that silence would cost. It would require continued vigilance, continued self-editing, continued acceptance that my discomfort was an acceptable trade-off for organizational calm. And worse, it would teach the system that this pattern worked. I could confront the contractor directly. That option tempted me briefly. A private conversation, calm, clear boundaries. It might even go well. He could apologize, adjust, move on. But it would leave no record. And if anything happened later, if roles shifted, if narratives changed, that conversation would vanish into ambiguity. It would be his word against mine, with no context and no trail. I could raise it informally with my manager. That option felt reasonable in theory. In practice, I knew how it would unfold. Concern would be reframed as perception. The emphasis would shift to intent. I would be advised to document going forward as if I hadn't already been doing so for months. The burden would remain with me. I could report formally to HR. That option was irreversible. Once a complaint enters the system, it doesn't stay neutral. It becomes an object to manage. A variable in risk assessment. A file that follows you in ways you're never fully shown. I understood that clearly now. I also understood that if I waited too long, if I let more time pass without action, the pattern I had documented would lose urgency. It would be easier to say it was resolved, that whatever had happened was no longer relevant. Timing mattered. The decision point wasn't about courage. It was about alignment. Could I continue to do my job knowing what I knew without speaking? The answer surprised me with how quickly it arrived. No. Not because I was afraid, because I was clear. I didn't want to be protected. I wanted the behavior to be named, so I chose the option that created a record. I drafted the report carefully, not late at night, not in a rush, during work hours, in the same tone I used for every other professional document. No emotional language, no speculation about intent, no demands. Just facts, dates, direct quotes, context, impact. I didn't label the behavior with dramatic terms. I referenced the policy language exactly as written. I explained why I believed the pattern met the threshold for concern. I also included something intentional, my continued performance record, not as defense, but as context. I wanted it to be clear that this wasn't retaliation for feedback or dissatisfaction with my role. It was about boundaries. Before submitting it, I reread it once, then once more. I asked myself one final question. If this document were read without my presence, would it still stand? It would, so I sent it. The moment after wasn't relief. It was stillness. No surge of emotion, no regret, just a quiet awareness that something had shifted, not in the system yet, but in my relationship to it. I had done the irreversible thing. Within hours, I received an automated acknowledgement from HR Neutral, polite, procedural. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We take these matters seriously. I didn't read anything into it. I knew better. What mattered wasn't the response. It was the timestamp. From that moment on, everything that happened next would exist in relation to that record. And whatever the outcome, I knew this much. I had chosen myself, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. There was no going back to unknowing, no returning to the version of me who absorbed quietly and hoped for fairness to emerge on its own. I had entered the system with open eyes, and now I would watch how it responded. After I submitted the report, I didn't change my behavior. That part is important. I didn't become distant. I didn't become guarded. I didn't withdraw or overperform. I kept the same cadence, the same tone, the same level of professionalism I had always maintained. From the outside, there was nothing to notice. Inside the system, however, something had shifted. HR scheduled an intake call 3 days later. The email was neutral, almost casual. No urgency, no framing, just a calendar invite and a brief agenda. Initial discussion regarding reported concerns. On the call, the HR representative was calm and practiced. She thanked me for documenting clearly. She asked clarifying questions. She took notes. I answered exactly what was asked. Nothing more, nothing less. When she asked how I wanted the situation resolved, I didn't hesitate. I want the behavior addressed and documented, I said. I want clear boundaries established so this doesn't happen again. Not punishment, not removal. Boundaries. She nodded, said that was reasonable. I knew better than to take reassurance at face value. After the call, I sent a follow-up email summarizing what we discussed. Dates, key points, my stated outcome. I thanked her for her time. The reply came the next morning. Thanks, Luna. This aligns with my notes. Alignment mattered. From that point on, I moved quietly. I didn't discuss the report with coworkers. I didn't hint at anything being in progress. I didn't alter my demeanor with the contractor beyond what I had already done. Professional, contained, minimal. He was noticeably careful now. Overly formal, distant. That too went in the notebook. At the same time, I paid attention to things unrelated to the complaint. I noticed my manager scheduling more frequent one-on-ones, asking broad questions about how I was feeling, whether I felt supported, whether my workload was manageable. The concern felt retrospective, as if someone had asked him to check a box. I responded honestly, but succinctly. Work was fine. Priorities were clear. No concerns at the moment. I didn't volunteer information. Moving in silence meant not narrating my own experience. Behind the scenes, I also began making quiet logistical decisions. I didn't announce them. I didn't rush. I downloaded copies of performance reviews. I saved emails praising my work. I ensured that ongoing projects had clear documentation showing my contributions. Not defensively. Precisely. I also reviewed my calendar from the past year, noting patterns around meetings, feedback, and timing. I didn't add interpretation, just structure. Weeks passed. HR followed up once with a few additional questions. Again, neutral. Again, procedural. The contractor's manager was looped in. A coaching conversation was mentioned. Nothing was shared with me directly. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was how quickly the organization's focus shifted from the reported behavior to the potential disruption. I began hearing words like realignment and resource planning in leadership updates. Nothing pointed, nothing explicit, just context. Then came the first subtle signal. A project I had led for over a year was reassigned. No explanation beyond capacity balancing. I was informed after the decision had already been made. I acknowledged it, asked for a transition timeline, wrote a clean handoff document. No reaction. Then a meeting was removed from my calendar, one I had always been part of. When I asked about it, I was told it had been streamlined. Still nothing overt. Still nothing I could point to and say, this is retaliation. But patterns don't require labels to be real. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't speculate out loud. I continued documenting. Moving in silence meant letting the system reveal its priorities without interference. And what it revealed was this: the discomfort caused by my report was being managed, not resolved. And managing discomfort often looks like repositioning the person who created it. I understood that now. I wasn't afraid. I was prepared. Because whatever was coming next would not arrive as punishment. It would arrive as a business decision. Clean, polite, justified. And when it did, I intended to be ready. Not to fight it emotionally, but to see it clearly for what it was. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded the way most corporate decisions do, incrementally, quietly, with enough plausible deniability that no single moment could be isolated and named as the cause. If you weren't paying attention, you would have missed them entirely. I noticed because I had learned how to watch without reacting. It began with distance. My manager became less specific in our one-on-ones. Where we once discussed deliverables and timelines, conversations drifted toward abstraction, big picture alignment, evolving priorities. Language that sounded thoughtful but committed to nothing. I listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. The answers were careful. Then came exclusion, not overt, but procedural. Decisions that used to involve me were made upstream. I was informed after the fact. My input was requested less frequently, and when it was offered, it was acknowledged but rarely acted on. I wasn't reprimanded. I was softened. It's a subtle thing being deprioritized without explanation. There's no conflict to point to, no behavior to correct, just a gradual sense that your presence is no longer essential. What struck me was how quickly this shift followed the HR process. 3 weeks. Not immediate enough to be obvious, not distant enough to be a coincidence. In team meetings, I noticed how my absence from certain conversations created small gaps. Questions went unanswered, risks went unflagged. Someone else would fill the space, less thoroughly but visibly. No one said my name. That's how consequences begin. Not with accusation, but with erasure. At the same time, I sensed a change in how others interacted with me. Not colder, more cautious. Conversations ended sooner, jokes were filtered, people seemed unsure what version of me they were supposed to engage with. I didn't reassure them. It wasn't my role to manage their discomfort anymore. The contractor was no longer part of my day-to-day. That on paper looked like a resolution. The behavior had stopped. Boundaries had been enforced, indirectly, quietly. But the cost of that resolution was being redistributed. Me. One afternoon, I received a meeting invite titled Organizational Update. My manager and someone from HR were listed. No agenda. I didn't panic. I recognized the structure. Before the meeting, I reviewed my documentation, not because I planned to use it, but because I wanted to ground myself in reality. Facts have a way of cutting through narrative. The meeting itself was brief. They spoke in calm, professional tones. There had been a strategic realignment. My role, they said, was being impacted. They emphasized that this was not performance-related, that my contributions were valued, that the decision was purely business. 3 weeks after my report, I listened without interrupting. They offered a severance package, standard, clean, time-limited. They emphasized confidentiality. I asked one question. Can you clarify how the timing of this decision relates to the HR report I submitted? There was a pause. A measured one. They said the two were unrelated, that decisions like these take time, that multiple factors were involved. I nodded. I didn't argue, because arguing would have turned the moment emotional, defensive, subjective. Instead, I asked for everything in writing. They agreed. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a few minutes. Not to process feelings, but to notice my body. There was no shock, no disbelief, just confirmation. The complaint had disappeared. My job had not. The consequences weren't explosive. They were administrative, efficient, designed to conclude the matter with minimal friction. And in that moment, I understood something deeply unsettling and deeply clarifying. The system had resolved the risk, not by addressing the behavior, but by removing the variable that had documented it. Me. What surprised me wasn't the outcome. It was how calm I felt. Because I had seen it coming, and because I knew, without needing to say it out loud, that what had just happened would not remain invisible. Not to me. Not on record. After the meeting, the tone changed. Not toward me. I was already gone in their minds, but among them. You can feel it when an organization realizes it has moved too quickly. Not in panic exactly, more like a quiet recalibration. The kind that happens when someone notices a decision has consequences they hadn't fully modeled. My manager reached out the next day. Not formally, not through HR. Just checking in, he wrote. I know this is a lot. I replied politely, briefly, thanked him for the note. I didn't fill the silence with reassurance. That's when the questions started. Not direct ones, indirect, carefully worded. HR asked if I had any feedback on the process, whether I felt heard, whether there was anything they could do to support the transition. Support is an interesting word. It often arrives after decisions are finalized. I responded factually. I confirmed receipt of the severance documents. I asked clarifying questions about timelines and benefits. I said nothing about how I felt, because how I felt was no longer relevant. What mattered was what existed on record. I noticed a subtle urgency in their replies. Faster turnaround, more attention to phrasing. Someone had realized that this situation, if examined closely, didn't look clean. The timeline was the problem. 3 weeks is a short window in corporate time. Short enough that explanations blur, long enough that deniability can be claimed, but not long enough to erase correlation. I could sense the organization trying to retroactively stabilize the narrative, emphasizing restructuring, highlighting budget shifts, referencing conversations that had never included me. It was too late, because narratives don't just exist in emails. They exist in patterns. And the pattern here was simple. I reported harassment. The complaint went quiet. I was removed. They didn't need to say it out loud for it to be true. What surprised them, I think, was my lack of reaction. I didn't threaten legal action. I didn't demand meetings. I didn't escalate emotionally. That unsettled them. There's a script for employees who are laid off. Shock, grief, anger, negotiation. When you don't follow it, people don't know how to respond. I followed the process exactly as written. I reviewed documents, I asked precise questions, I met deadlines, and I stayed quiet. That quiet wasn't compliance, it was containment, because everything that could be said had already been documented. I declined an optional exit conversation framed as a chance to share reflections. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood how those conversations are used. They gather information without creating an obligation. I didn't offer free context. Instead, I sent one final email to HR professional, neutral, unemotional. I thanked them for coordinating the process. I confirmed my understanding of the severance terms, and I included one sentence at the end. For clarity, I am maintaining copies of all documentation related to my HR report and subsequent role elimination for my records. That sentence changed the temperature. The reply came quickly. Understood, they wrote. Please let us know if you need anything further. They didn't ask follow-up questions. They didn't invite more discussion. They understood what that sentence meant. Too late to fix it doesn't mean immediate consequences. It means the window to control the story has closed. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I wasn't plotting exposure or retaliation. I didn't need to. The record already existed. The company would move on. My role would be backfilled or restructured. The contractor would continue working, now more carefully than before. But something permanent had shifted. The organization now had a file it couldn't delete without risk, a timeline that didn't align cleanly, a decision that looked efficient but not ethical under scrutiny. And I had something else. Distance. With distance comes perspective, and with perspective comes power, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that endures. They had resolved the immediate discomfort by removing me. What they hadn't done was erase the truth. And once truth exists on paper, it has a way of resurfacing, quietly, patiently, when conditions are right. I didn't need to fix anything. They already knew. The confrontation didn't look like one. There was no dramatic meeting, no raised voices, no moment where anyone stood their ground. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more revealing. It came a week before my official end date. HR requested a final call. The invitation was framed as administrative, a quick check-in to ensure a smooth closeout. My manager was included, so was a senior HR partner I hadn't spoken with before. I accepted. When the call began, the tone was polite, almost overly so. Gratitude was expressed, appreciation reiterated. The company's values were referenced. Everything sounded careful. They asked if I had any outstanding concerns. I paused, not for effect, but because I wanted to be exact. Yes, I said, I'd like to clarify something for the record. The room went very still. I didn't accuse, I didn't argue, I didn't speculate about intent. I stated facts. I referenced the date I submitted my HR report. I referenced the acknowledgement email. I referenced the subsequent changes to my role. And finally, I referenced the meeting in which I was informed my position was being eliminated. I spoke slowly, calmly, without emphasis. I'm not asking for this decision to be reversed, I said. I'm asking for acknowledgement that the proximity of these events creates the appearance of retaliation, whether intended or not. No one interrupted me. That was the confrontation. Not a demand, not a threat, a statement of record. The senior HR partner responded first. Her tone was measured. She said the company took these concerns seriously, that they stood by the business rationale for the decision, that they did not view the actions as retaliatory. I nodded. I understand that's your position, I said. I want to be clear that my intention here is not to debate it. It's to ensure my understanding and my documentation are complete. There was another pause. My manager spoke next. He said he was sorry the situation had unfolded this way, that it was unfortunate, that the timing was difficult. Unfortunate is a word people use when they don't want to say accountable. I didn't correct him. I thanked them for their time, confirmed my final date, asked one logistical question about benefits. And that was it. No one apologized. No one admitted fault. No one escalated. But something had shifted. Because I had named the thing they were working so carefully to avoid naming, without hostility, without emotion, without accusation. I had removed their ability to pretend it didn't exist. After the call, I received an updated severance document. One clause had changed slightly, language tightened around non-retaliation and compliance with policy. It was subtle, but it was there. That was the only outward acknowledgement I ever received, and it was enough. Confrontation without heat doesn't force confession. It forces awareness. They now knew that I knew exactly what had happened, that I wasn't confused, that I wasn't emotional, that I wasn't looking for validation or closure. I was complete. There's a particular kind of authority that comes from being calm when you're expected to be shaken, from stating the truth without asking it to be affirmed. I didn't walk away feeling victorious. I walked away feeling intact. Because I had spoken when it mattered, clearly, professionally, and on record, and I hadn't compromised myself to do it. That was the quiet dominance I hadn't known how to name before. Not control over others, control over myself. When people ask what it was like to be laid off, I don't tell them the story they expect. I don't talk about shock or devastation. I don't frame it as betrayal or loss of identity. Those things happened, but they weren't the center. What changed me wasn't the ending. It was the clarity that came with it. For a long time, I had believed that professionalism meant endurance, that integrity meant absorbing discomfort without naming it, that staying calm was the same thing as staying safe. I know better now. I understand that systems don't protect individuals by default. They protect themselves. And that's not inherently malicious, it's structural. Once you see that, you stop taking things personally. You stop asking institutions to love you back. That realization gave me something unexpected: peace. I didn't rush into another job. I didn't immediately try to replace what I had lost. I took time to decompress, not by disconnecting, but by integrating what I had learned. I reviewed my documentation one last time and then put it away, not to hide it, to close the chapter. I reached out to a few trusted people, not to vent, but to listen. I noticed how many of them had similar stories, quieter ones, often unfinished. The common thread wasn't incompetence or weakness. It was compliance disguised as professionalism. I started consulting, eventually, on my terms: short engagements, clear scopes, written boundaries. I was careful about where I invested my energy. I noticed that the skills I had honed in silence, observation, pattern recognition, emotional regulation, were suddenly visible as strengths, not because they had changed, but because the context had. I no longer tried to be low maintenance. I tried to be precise. Precision requires boundaries. It requires naming things early, clearly, and without apology, not aggressively, accurately. I don't assume good intent anymore. I assume responsibility, from myself first. That doesn't mean I'm suspicious or guarded. It means I don't outsource my clarity to other people's interpretations. If something feels off, I investigate it. If a boundary is crossed, I address it while the record is clean. I don't wait for patterns to become stories I have to untangle later. I'm still calm. But my calm is no longer mistaken for tolerance. The quiet dominance people talk about isn't about being unreadable or aloof. It's about not needing to perform your values, about aligning your actions with your understanding, even when it's inconvenient. I don't regret reporting to HR, even knowing the outcome, because the outcome wasn't just a layoff. It was the end of a particular illusion that fairness emerges automatically if you're patient enough. It doesn't. Fairness is built, sometimes slowly, sometimes imperfectly, often by people who are willing to document reality when it would be easier to adapt to it. I didn't win, but I didn't lose myself, and that matters more than any title. Who I am now is simpler. I trust my perception. I choose my silence. I keep records. I walk away when alignment disappears. Not loudly, not bitterly, just clearly. There's a version of this story that would end with a warning. A version where I tell you to never trust HR, to document everything obsessively, to assume the worst in every professional interaction. That version would be easy. It would feel protective. It would also be incomplete. The truth is quieter. Systems are not villains. They are incentives made visible. HR didn't wake up one day intending to erase my complaint. My manager didn't plan to retaliate. The company didn't sit around deciding how to punish someone for speaking up. What they did was choose the path of least disruption. And when you understand that, the story stops being personal and starts being instructive. The moral of this experience isn't don't speak up, it's know what speaking up changes. When you report harm, you introduce friction into a system designed to minimize it. Sometimes that friction results in accountability. Sometimes it results in containment. Both outcomes are shaped by timing, documentation, and how replaceable you are perceived to be. That's not fair, but it is real. What I want you to take from this isn't fear, it's an agency. Silence isn't weakness. Speaking isn't courage. Both are tools. The danger comes from using them unconsciously. I stayed silent for a long time because I believed it protected me. Then I spoke because I believed clarity mattered more than protection. Both decisions were deliberate. Neither was naive. If you're in a situation where something feels off, you don't need to escalate immediately. You also don't need to explain it away. You can observe. You can document. You can learn how the system around you actually works, not how it says it works. And when you do choose to act, act in a way that lets you sleep at night. Not because you won, because you were aligned. Justice doesn't always look like consequences you can see. Sometimes it looks like self-respect that outlives the moment. Sometimes it looks like a record that doesn't disappear, even when your role does. I didn't get closure from the company. I gave it to myself. And if there's one thing I know now, it's this: The quietest people often carry the clearest memory of how things really happened. Systems forget, individuals don't. So if this story resonated with you, even uncomfortably, I'd like to hear from you. Not for validation, for understanding. Have you ever noticed a moment when staying quiet felt safer until it didn't? Share your experience in the comments if you feel ready. Sometimes naming it is the first step toward clarity, and sometimes clarity is enough.